Morning. Let's do that again. Good morning. Good morning. That's better. Congratulations on making it to day 3 or day 4 of Climate Week, and for actually making it here this morning in the rain and everything else. And so early. I am a tad nervous. I got the Just team right here. I got my old boss, Chris Walker, somewhere in this room, who hired me 20 years ago. He's one of the reasons I'm in New York. So I better get this right. We have a half-hour session. I'm going to spend 10 minutes on some great research that we've done on corporate climate disclosures. And the people who actually did the work are right here. Laura Thornton, Shannon's, I guess, not here. Ben, Lindsay, the corporate engagement team. So if you have any questions about what you're about to see, don't ask me, ask them. And then after 10 minutes, I'm going to welcome on stage Erik from Workday. Erik is the head of sustainability there, and we're going to have a conversation about their leadership. Workday is a $1.5 billion revenue enterprise cloud service provider, and they've been in the Just 100 for 3 years. And they are a real leader on corporate climate disclosure. So who is walking the talk? Let me start just by talking about what we do. Basically 3 things. We survey at great length the American people about what they think about companies and how they think about this idea of a just company. So we go all around the country talking to tens of thousands of everyday Americans, yes, Republicans and Democrats, but fully representative of American society to get a pulse on what they really prioritize when it comes to corporate behavior today. We then take all of those issues and we track, measure, and rank how large publicly traded companies perform on those issues. And our universe right now is the Russell 1000, the 1,000 largest publicly traded companies in the States. And then the thing is we take all of that data, all of that research, and we do things that drive change. We work with investors, investment products. We work with the media to really lift up stories of leadership, try and provide incentives for change. And then really work that I think is defining for us is our work with the companies themselves. We sort of see them almost as a customer. We want the companies to be more just. So we develop programs and showcase leaders like Erik and really try and drive change that way through the carrot, not the stick. So that's sort of what we do. Very research focused and very survey based. And here you see some results of survey that we did recently with series around corporate disclosure and the appetite, the desire among the public for corporate disclosure on climate data, and in particular around federal requirements. And you can see here 2 things. Number 1, a lot of people want more data on what companies are doing on climate. Number 2, there's not a lot of division. Actually, when you look across all the demographic and the political cuts, this is the same for many of the issues that we track. You see a lot of agreement. And I know we're in a week where there's, a lot of talk of division. It's been my sense of this week. The pushback against the ESG, we don't see that. Not in the polling, not in what Main Street America wants. So people want more data. They want to know what companies are doing, who's walking the walk. Here's how we measure companies on their climate commitments. This is sort of the breakdown from the 5 stakeholder-related issues, which all the conversations with the public, all the polling sort of roll up to these 5 areas. The percentages are relative priorities in the overall aggregate general population. I suspect in this room more people would heavily weight the environment, but that's okay. You can use the Just Capital platform for that. We break each of those stakeholder issues down into sort of like the sub-issues there you can see. And here, this is around combats global climate change. That's what people are really responding to. We then develop metrics. Our team, the research team, develops the metrics for how we're going to measure that. How are we actually going to analyze companies on that? And then we go gather data. And the data points here you see on the far right, as you look at it, in sort of descending order of, let's say, ambition. So you have science-based targets, 1.5 degree warming scenario, science-based targets, or a 2 degree warming scenario, net zero by 2050 commitments, and then sort of a general emission reduction commitment. So those are the 4 things for the just shy of 1,000 companies that we're gathering data on. And I'm just going to show you what that looks like, what the results of that work is. So here you see level of commitment. From last year in orange to this year in blue. Emission reductions, almost half the universe have some form of emission reduction commitment. You see also a really strong uptick in net zero by 2050 commitments. That's over, more than doubling from last year. I think the other thing you see is there have been increases in science-based targets in both of those scenarios, but still a very small percentage of the overall group of companies have adopted science-based targets. When you break it down by industry, here you see the percentage of companies in each industry that have adopted 1.5 degree warming scenario science-based targets. I don't know what's going on in the clothing and accessories industry, but they are way out in front in terms of their commitment to serious sort of emissions reductions. I also wanted to point out on the far right, the utilities sector. Obviously very emissions intensive. And so you see, actually, I'll show you on the next slide, sort of how the emissions intensity of an industry stacks up relative to the level of ambition of emission reduction commitment. So this is across all industries now. And you can see here, you have, again, this is for the 1.5 degree science-based target scenario. You see here the sort of level of emissions intensity. And obviously, the message of this chart is that most of the commitments that are being made are not in emissions intensive industries. On the right, you can see this sort of orange line is the industry level emissions intensity. And I think you can see utilities there, I've already mentioned, but I draw your attention to oil and gas, if you can read that on the far right. And then the other big sort of uptick is basic resources. And I think I'm right in saying that no company in those industries have adopted a 1.5 degree or even a 2 degree science-based targets initiative. Is that right? I think there's one company in the utilities space that has done that. Who is that, Laura? Don't know. One company. So that's sort of worrying if you want to lower emissions. Industries where you have most of the emissions are not really, embracing the most aggressive emissions reduction scenarios. So when we talk about what sort of commitments we're looking for, like how do we know companies are really, walking the walk? These are the things that we're gathering data on. And here are the top 100 companies in our climate change issue. So you take the top 100 companies that are best on this issue. Here are the 12 things that we're tracking. So that's sort of the data that we're gathering. We want to know, okay, how do you know that they're making progress? How do you know that they're going in the right direction? You can't just state the target and come back in, December 2049 with the result. We want to see what's happening along the way. And interestingly, here's the breakdown of those top 100 companies based on what level of commitment they've made and the extent of their disclosure. And you can see on the emissions reductions, It's probably the lowest level. If I go back to those issues there you see, from emission percentage reduction all the way down to use of carbon sinks. You see emissions, those companies that have made a general emission reduction commitment are really at the lowest level of disclosure across those 12 issues. So it's kind of hard to know who's really making progress. Whereas those who have made net zero by 2050 commitments are actually far out in front. They're certainly not all across the board. This is the average number of commitments. So you see 7.7. We have 12 overall. So it's not great, but it's the best of all those types of corporate commitments that have been made. And I think the number that we did some math just preparing for this. Basically, if you look at all the commitments that companies have made, covers about 50% of emissions, something like that. All the commitments across all the different types. So still a huge amount, even within the Russell 1000, still a huge amount of corporate climate commitments that are sort of unaccounted for or just absent altogether. I'm going to finish just on this slide, the last piece of data. This is sort of interim targets. I'm going to be running the New York Marathon in a month or so against my better judgment, and I'm sort of checking how I'm doing along the way. Am I going to be okay, part way through to my goal? Well, this is exactly what we're measuring with these companies. What are they saying about that sort of check-ins? Their interim targets. And you can see here, again, across the 4 commitment levels, how many have actually set an interim target and how many haven't. And I think what jumps out to me in that data is how many haven't, no interim targets. I mean, how do you know you're going to get there? So I think the takeaway from this is improving. Go back to the first slide, 22, way better than 2021. Net zero by 2050, probably the area where we see most uptick. But in terms of the science-based targets, still a long, long way to go. And one of the interesting things about Workday is they have been a leader on science-based targets. We're going to unpack why that is with Erik Hansen. Erik, if you can join me on stage right now, that would be great. So Erik Hansen is a senior director. Please give him a round of applause. Erik is the Senior Director of Environmental Sustainability at Workday. It's a great pleasure to be with you. Thank you for joining us. Yeah, come all the way from San Francisco. Also a very just company. And I mentioned earlier you've been in the Just 100 for 3 years straight. But in terms of your climate work, maybe just talk a little bit first all about Workday overall, how your role fits into that, and then maybe take us to the climate work in particular, and then we can dive into that.
Yeah, absolutely. So first, thank you. Thank you for inviting us here. We really appreciate it, honored. So for those of you that don't know Workday, Workday is an enterprise cloud application provider for finance and HR. So we provide thousands of organizations globally across industries with applications to help them adapt and thrive in a changing world. And that spans financial management, spend management, human capital management, planning, analytics, globally, from medium-sized enterprises and businesses all the way to more than 50% of the Fortune 500. So what I do is I have the privilege of leading our global environmental sustainability efforts. So that includes everything from climate strategy, renewable energy, to carbon accounting, to green building, and our voluntary ESG reporting, which we call our Global Impact Report. Yeah.
We talked about your leadership, especially around science-based targets. I know there's a lot of companies in the room and a lot of people in the room who are working on that. Maybe deconstruct that for us. How hard is that? How did that sort of happen at Workday? What led up to that? And maybe help us understand what does that actually mean in a practical way, for you and your team and for the company?
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, right? It's the basic tenets of stakeholder capitalism, right? We have stakeholders that are, we have customers. We're part of their supply chain, and they're looking to us to reduce our emissions because we're part of their supply chain. We're part of their Scope 3 footprint. We were really founded with a set of core values years ago by our co-founders, Dave Duffield and Anil Bushri, and those core values still really, guide a lot of our decisions today. It makes my job a lot easier because I can point to those. We started procuring renewable energy, as an example, way back in 2008. I joined the company in 2010. I've been there for 12 years now. We were already on that journey towards 100% renewable back then. And so what we looked at is...
And you've hit your targets way ahead of schedule.
We have. We hit, an RE100 renewable energy target a number of years ago, so 2019. But now the question is, how do we ramp up the impact there? How do we move away from, unbundled renewable energy certificates and into really high impact renewables, which we can talk about in a bit. And so the next evolution of that is science-based targets. And when you look at the landscape as a corporate, what are the most meaningful climate commitments that you can make? You have to start with a science-based target. And you can skip 2 degrees now. It's, SBTI only allows 1.5 degrees. And that's the target that we set out for when we began that journey about 18 months ago. We just had our targets approved about 6 months ago. Yeah.
You saw the data that I presented about the sort of distribution of types of commitment. We talked about that in the green room. Why do you think U.S. company adoption of science-based targets has been, let's say, so slow? Or do you think it's been slow? Are you surprised at how fast companies are moving?
I think it's ramping up. I honestly do. So we, as part of our science-based target, when for most companies, your purchase goods and services are a huge part of your carbon footprint, including Workday. And so, SBTI allows you to essentially set a science-based target around supplier engagement. So you cover all of your emissions from your purchase goods and services, capital goods, with a supplier engagement target where you're asked to have 2/3 of your suppliers on a spend basis set science-based targets of their own. And presumably, if they set targets across their scope 1 and 2, those are going to drive down emissions across your entire supply chain. I think that, in particular, is going to be a big driver for more companies to adopt science-based targets. And the clock is ticking. It's a 5-year interim target, essentially. And so, companies like us are going to be reaching out to our key suppliers and with the expectation that they're going to set science-based targets of their own. So I expect that to take up. One of the ways that we're going to do that ourselves is we're actually introducing a supplier sustainability application. And that'll be available in the next couple of months. We're going to launch that. We'll be an early adopter ourselves. And that application will allow us to measure the carbon footprint on a spend basis across our Scope 3. All of our purchase goods and services, all of our customers can use that. You can survey your suppliers, engage with them, set meaningful environmental targets that are attached to those particular suppliers, but then even do some basic analytics around your Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions as well.
So you'll make that available to your suppliers?
To our customers, And so we will use that ourselves to engage with our suppliers to help drive down those emissions. And so what we're hoping, every company has to use their own superpower to address climate, right? And so for us, it's enterprise applications.
Yeah, it sort of, it's interesting how you see that, as more of a, through your own stakeholders, you talk about your customers. Talk a little bit, if you will, about the business case for sustainability leadership, for climate leadership at Workday. How prominent has making the business case been for you and for other, your colleagues? Has it been easy? Has it been difficult? What challenges have you encountered?
Yeah, I mean, mentioned the core values being a real driver there. I'd be lying if I said those core values weren't what I point to first and foremost every single time I'm going to leadership and saying, hey, we have a big, bold commitment that we need to make. And why? Because of this set of core values, integrity being one of them. We can't look at our customers with a straight face with integrity and say that we're not doing everything that we can to reduce our emissions because, as I said, we're a major part of a lot of our customers' supply chain. Our employees as well. Their employees expect us to be setting those ambitious targets around climate, especially as the workforce starts to skew a little bit younger. So in all honesty, the business case is usually less compelling than the case to be made that this is an expectation to be a leader in the space. And that if you look across all of your various stakeholders, they're all expecting you to be doing this. It's the right thing to do, right? Yeah, there is a business case because you can look at each of those stakeholders and say, our shareholders, our employees, our customers are all demanding this. So that's easier to point to, but I think it really starts with the core values of our organization. And so I would advise anyone who's out there trying to figure this out right now, look at the internal DNA of your organization and figure out what really resonates with leadership at your company, and then find a way to tie that back to climate. And in my experience in talking to peers, that often resonates a lot more with leadership than just the pure, financial business case.
One of the things we do at Just, which I also alluded to, was connect the dots between different stakeholders, workers, communities, customers you mentioned, the environment, and shareholders. Obviously, climate is an issue which is very much connected, not just to emissions reductions, but very strong social, health, jobs. It's related to so much of the fabric of society and the economy. Talk a little bit about how you see the connections at Workday in your work. Climate justice and social justice issues more broadly. I know Workday has a lot of commitments across the board on sustainability and stakeholder value creation. Tease those out for us. Where do you see those strong, and how have those affected your thinking?
Yeah, it's a great question. Again, it's back to those sort of core values, root that understanding of our impacts on society and our stakeholders. I think, for us, from a climate perspective, you sort of have to recognize that the individuals who are going to be disproportionately impacted by climate change and by air pollution and the burning of fossil fuels, those are communities of color. Those are often low-income communities. Those are often and mostly communities that didn't cause climate change, right? And don't have the resources to be resilient in the face of climate change, right? And so, obviously, there's intrinsic value to nature. We value what we're doing, on its face. But you have to remember that there's a real social impact to climate, and that's what we're trying to address as well. And I'll give you an example. Right now, we're in the midst of working on our next large utility-scale solar farm power purchase agreement, and we can't announce it yet. It's in the works, hopefully in the next few months. But it's going to be a real impact-driven power purchase agreement. And what that means is we're really looking at demographic data. We're looking at how do we displace the marginal fossil fuel resource that presumably is very, very high pollution and impacting local communities, and then map that to demographic data to really come up with an environmental justice lens to that particular project. And we can select a project that minimizes, or in some cases maximizes, the displacement of those fossil fuel resources, as opposed to just siting that project somewhere close to wherever your facilities are. And so that's the sort of environmental justice impact lens that we're hoping we inspire other people to go out and do. We're an early funder in the Clean Energy Buyers Association's, Clean Energy Buyers Institute, their nonprofit twin. they're beyond the megawatt initiative. And that is taking, a justice, an equity, a resilience lens to large-scale renewables. And it's not enough to just be volumetric on your renewable purchases. We're hoping that you could really have that focus on other, social and environmental impacts.
It's sort of, I think, a hallmark of leadership when you are able to connect the dots in that way. We see that across many of the companies that we track. We tend to silo these issues, whereas in fact they're not siloed at all. You've also been quite public in your support for SEC action on climate disclosure, and your public position on climate policy. We talked about disclosure and transparency. Certainly, it's what the American people seem to want: more information. Was that an issue within Workday as to how public you want to be, how outspoken you want to be? Was there any concerns about doing that?
So I'm privileged to actually sit within, I have a small team. Our sustainability team actually sits within our larger corporate affairs team. And think of corporate affairs as, policy, government affairs, engagement. So we sit there, with our friends on our team, and sat down and said, we really need to, we're engaging on policy here, on climate policy. Let's put a position statement out there that really codifies that and says, this is what we're going to focus on. Here are our priorities. And we made that public in part because we're hoping to inspire others to do the same, right? So it actually wasn't a hard conversation.
Okay.
There's
been no backlash? There's no,
quite the opposite. And yeah, we weighed in on the SEC climate rules. From our perspective, what we shared really was around Scope 3 emissions. And so, we are really advocated for a proper safe harbor around disclosure of those emissions, knowing that without that, some companies might be scared off and are not going to want to disclose those emissions. We want that transparency, but with a proper safe harbor that sort of allows the vehicle to do those disclosures. But it's been really great to really lean in a little bit on climate policy. And let's face it, with something as big as climate change, you're not going to solve it unilaterally as a singular company. We're a $5 billion a year revenue company, about 16,000 employees globally. We're not going to solve climate change on our own. Policy has to play a role.
Yeah. You alluded to the size of your team.
Yeah.
How big is your team?
Yeah. So we are, as of a month ago, we are a 3-person team. Sustainability on a broader corporate affairs team.
So you're doing an awful lot for probably 2 people and now 3. Is that, I guess you must therefore have the support of all of your colleagues. So you're a huge organization, global organization. I'm sure there's a lot of people here who, empathize with that. If you've been in a company, or you're involved in sustainability in the corporately, that those teams typically are small and under a lot of pressure. How have you managed to achieve all these things with such a small? You must be an amazing team.
It's a great team, really, a great team. I think in many ways, I keep mentioning the core values. It's being able to go to leadership directly and saying, hey, this is really important for us. But then also, I would advise every practitioner out there who is looking to make change at your organization and don't know where to begin, really prioritize on the high leverage, high impact areas. Get the ball rolling on the high impact areas. We don't have time to waste, especially on climate. Then you can focus on, all of the remaining areas that are maybe a little bit more difficult to tackle, maybe a little bit more challenging. You can do it with a small team, but make friends across the organization. You'd be surprised how many people are passionate about this area in finance, in accounting, in legal, et cetera. And make friends with those people, and you get a lot more done with a small team.
Anything else you'd like to add before we go? I know we're a little bit over.
Yeah.
Any other topic, anything you'd like to cover? If not?
No, just, we don't have time to delay, so especially on climate. Every company, no matter your industry, climate should be your #1 environmental focus area. And so get out there, be bold, be ambitious. We can figure out how to get the work done later. I do know of one solution that can help you solve your Scope 3 supply chain emissions, but just get out there, roll up your sleeves, get the work done now, get started now. That's really my biggest recommendation.
Well, I want to thank you and Workday and all of your colleagues for your leadership, seriously. And I want to thank you all for coming out early this morning. If you want to know anything about Just Capital, any of the data that I presented, just go to justcapital.com or speak to me or any of my colleagues that are here. And again, thank you, and hope you enjoy the rest of your week. Thanks, Erik. Really appreciate it. Thank you.